Let's bring in our guest because he's awesome. Dude, I've wanted to have on the show for quite some time. Never got to meet him in person until I saw him at the Rage Against the War Machine rally fam. He was out there covering it. I thought I should be speaking. I would love to talk COVID with this gentleman one day outside of YouTube, maybe on the morning show, or come back on the Convo Couch. We could do it on Rokfin and Rumble only because this guy is great. I'd love to go on his show and talk about the COVID stuff. The stuff he's talking about is amazing, but he's also great in foreign policy. He's an amazing journalist. He is an Assange advocate. He is a TNT radio host. He is the Patrick Henningsen. How you doing, Patrick? You're muted. It's okay.
There we go. Then great to be with you. Great to be with you.
Oh man, I'm so happy you're here. Fiorella, Patrick, Fiorella.
Pleasure. Good to meet you.
Good to meet you. Yes, I've definitely seen you online for sure, but never formally met online. Good to have you. So, fam, you were excited to have him on. What exactly are we're going to be talking about a little bit about Russia, Ukraine?
Yeah.
Because obviously that's dominating the news right now, and there's so much developing every day. And we've entered a new phase, I believe. It's the Russian offensive phase that we're seeing being played out. So, Pasta, did you want to start off?
No. Why don't we just start right there? I mean, what I had planned on Monday was to ask you about Zelensky's comments as far as, being like, if you're not an American supporting this money, then you're terrible. And then he kind of followed up. I think it was the same. I don't know if it was the same interview, but he followed it up by saying that if, in fact, you don't ship us the money, if you don't give us the F-16s, if you don't give us the long-range missiles, we're going to have to, be defeated. And eventually Russia, because, Vladimir Putin woke up one morning and said, I want to recreate the Soviet Union. And he decided to go into Ukraine. He's then going to go into the Baltic states, Patrick. And that means American children are going to have to spoil their blood, all in the sake of keeping the Baltic states under NATO's oppression. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Zelensky's kind of gone a little bit over the top on this one. The problem is, he's a professional sort of media character now. He's an avatar for a foreign policy information war as well. So he's constantly opining on things that, and he tends to fall back on the same tropes, making these kind of emotional appeals in the way that, it's good in television. It's good if you're some kind of a political advocate, but he's supposed to be president of this country embroiled in this war. And he sort of falls back on the exact same things. He's always trying to go for the emotional strings of the West in order to garner more continuous support, and hanging out with, being validated by Hollywood celebrities constantly, or political celebrities. I always said politics is the new Hollywood post 2015, and so all these political celebrities parachuting into Kiev, and it's kind of inflated his own ego, and he probably believes in a certain way he's a thought leader as well in this conversation. He's completely not. He's got a very limited scope of political analysis, of understanding of politics and geopolitics, I think. So, he's pretty much repeating the exact same lines that are being, fed to us through Western mainstream media, by Western politicians, etc. So, and he's just recycling all that back. And I don't think he understands that, there's a limit to this kind of Zelensky brand that's been kind of this construct. There's a limit to how much utility is there with regards to this conflict. And I always said to people, and I said this a couple of times. I even said this when I gave a talk once on this. When there's a war going on and there's a quote state of emergency, you can get away with pretty much anything. As long as there's a state of emergency, everyone will sort of park all their concerns down the road. As soon as it stops, in other words, as soon as there's a negotiation, as soon as there's peace talks, okay, then all of a sudden there's this massive audit that takes place. People in Ukraine, people in Europe, people in the United States will think, wow, look, as soon as you have a chance to breathe, and pause, then you say, how did we get here to begin with? And all that conversation begins. That's the sober conversation. That's been postponed. That's not allowed to happen in our media, and it's not allowed to happen politically. And then certain people will take responsibility. They'll have to be held accountable. He's one of those people. He has not been he has not had to have been held accountable to this point. He's just been the avatar, the hero, the spokesperson for this anti-Russian effort. And even with his own people, we don't know. We don't hear about what Ukrainians think. All we hear is very curated viewpoints. Their media is completely under state control, and so we don't hear all that. And then the blowback would begin as soon as he would be then accused, probably by a lot of his own people in Ukraine, as being responsible for losing a third of the country, a third of the population's left, third of the land mass is gone, 100,000, 150,000 plus, maybe. No one knows for sure how many dead soldiers. You know, in our country, in America, as soon as you say, 10,000 dead servicemen, people would start freaking out. You're talking in 12 months, double what the U.S. lost in Vietnam over a 10-year period, over a decade. And you don't think there's a political price that he's going to pay for that? That's his legacy. It's in what they're doing now is just selling this fantasy projection that Ukraine is on the verge of defeating Russia. Russia's running out of ammo. Russian morale's at an all-time low. Yada yada. Is a whole list of stuff. So we're not living in reality. The West is living in a kind of delusional state, this purgatory, narrative purgatory, and it's all held in place by a state of war and a state of emergency. And it is a good example. You mentioned COVID just a minute ago, Craig, in the intro. The same thing. As soon as the state of emergency is over, and you look at all the blowback now and all the policies, and people are running for the hills now. Everybody that was in charge of anything doesn't want to talk, and literally they're in full rearguard action because the state of emergency is over. That's part of the psychological operation for the Ukraine conflict, not just for us in the West, but literally for Ukraine itself. That's why we're working so hard to prop him up, protect him, protect the narrative. Don't talk about dead soldiers. It's a blackout on battlefield casualties. This is the first conflict in history where there's a blackout on battlefield casualties. That should be indication enough from people to see how contrived and how carefully managed the information around this conflict is. It's completely disingenuous.
Well, really quickly before Fam asks a question, Fam's just a nickname for me and Fiorella. We have for each other, short for family. But those people who are running for cover for COVID, don't forget, Patrick, they got the WHO treaty and the international health regulations that will hopefully protect them in the event of the next pandemic. So we have to watch about that. And don't ever forget, Putin cured COVID-19. Go ahead, Fam.
So shifting a little bit, just want to ask you, based on everything you said, what do you make of the fact that people say, Putin was unprovoked. Russia could have tried something else. I mean, I have exhausted myself trying to explain to people that Russia entered an ongoing conflict that had been going on since 2014, and you could even say before that. And of course, Ukraine is a country that was intervened by the U.S. We all know the story of Victoria Nuland and everybody else that went there, and how they intervened in that election and ousted their leader. So by default, Ukraine stopped being this sovereign country at that point. But this idea that Russia could have done something else, do you think that there was something else that Russia could have done after now 9 years, but then 8 years of not just death in the Donbass, but obviously the expansion of NATO? We're seeing the push to make Finland and Sweden a part of NATO as fast as possible. And so what we're seeing, the way Russia looks at it from the interviews I've done and from the people I've talked to, is this is a fight for their lives. This is an existential war to keep Russia as it exists. And they're very much not where Europe is going as far as the liberal agenda, as far as so many agendas. So they see this as a fight for their lives now. It's no longer just about this sort of denazification and the border. It's like, if all of this happens, then Russia ceases to exist. And that was the goal of NATO for a long time, was to break up Russia into small little sectors. What do you make of that statement of people saying, well, Putin could have tried something else? There's always another option beside war.
Yeah, so this is interesting. If you're having this argument, and we're all involved in this discussion and this argument, and the argument comes from the media, from U.S. politicians. You hear this from congressmen, senators too, when they're sort of grandstanding and pontificating, and shouting their sort of platitudes on this. It's so funny how the object of this conversation from a NATO or Western point of view is to have history begin on February 23rd, 2022. Nothing happened before that. All events must be judged without any context, no historical context, not even back a year, no, not even 6 months, not even definitely not back to 2014 or back to 2004 or 1991.
Yeah.
That's completely out of bounds. So it's a question of reframing the conversation. And one of the talking points you hear constantly, I hear them all the time because I'm in these debates with CIA analysts and Fox News pundits, foreign policy experts and stuff. And this is Putin's war of choice. He's violated the territorial sovereignty of a UN member state. And I'm like, the first thing I say in response is, since when has the United States or Britain or anybody else been suddenly concerned with international law? Wow, you guys are so really enthusiastic about it all of a sudden. And you can just go a litany of violations of international law, not just Iraq and not just Libya. Those are kind of obvious examples. Yemen as well, basically ran that war for Saudi Arabia. There's Afghanistan is also a good example, even though there is I believe in NATO Article 5 or a UN resolution on that at the time. But here's the point. Helsinki, the final act of Helsinki, more or less froze borders. That was the agreement. No movement on European borders, period. Right. So, and what happened? The United States and NATO blew that to pieces with the dismemberment of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And all of a sudden, it's like we don't allow unilateral secession. All of a sudden, they were promoting unilateral secession, broke up Yugoslavia into 1,000 pieces. And not only that, it wasn't enough. They created a NATO protectorate by prying that last piece off Serbia called Kosovo. They created a NATO protectorate in the heart of Europe. They talk about Ukraine like it's in the heart of Europe. It's not. It's on the fringe of Europe. It's on the Eastern European frontier of Europe. Yugoslavia is the heart of Europe. So you have a NATO protectorate, Kosovo. It's not recognized by its neighbors. It's not an official state still after all this time. So they destroyed this Helsinki Accord, Helsinki Agreement. So this already is a weak position for someone to make, because the situation that led to the current conflict in Donbass, there was a whole peace process before that, 8 years of the Minsk Accords, Minsk 1 and 2. And Angela Merkel's already on record saying, "Oh, this was just we sandbagged it." Germany and France, the guarantors, we sandbagged it to buy time to arm Ukraine. So there's already intent there, and so that's just a weak case made by anybody coming from the Washington or NATO perspective on that. But it's even worse than that, because you have the issue of Crimea again. It's there's the self-determination issue versus an annexation or violating the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Crimea, there's hardly any argument anyone can make in the West that's legitimate. Article 51 of the UN Charter. There's two sides to this coin: territorial sovereignty. The other side is called self-determination. And listen, what happened when you have a bloody, violent civil war in Ukraine for 8 years? Petro Poroshenko, a U.S.-backed puppet, literally a U.S.-installed Yatsenyuk regime, and then they had an election soon after that, and Poroshenko comes in, a puppet's puppet. He declares an anti-terror operation against the Donbass. So anybody in the Donbass who is not going along with the U.S.-backed putsch in Kiev is basically a terrorist. So when you raise a NATO-backed, NATO-armed, NATO-trained army against your own population, forget about NATO. Just you become at that point in that civil war epic, the clock is ticking of whether you're going to be a failed state or you're going to be a successful state. The United States had a civil war. It could have been a failed state, but it wasn't. And the Gettysburg Address, and then a new phase in history is created. That's not what's happened in Ukraine. Many states have failed. Multi-ethnic states, multinational states throughout history have failed because a civil war went bad. And then borders are redrawn, and you have autonomous regions that declare independence, that take. So by the letter of the UN Charter, if you want to qualify statehood, Donbass has ticked every single box perfectly. Yeah. Nearly. Now, Crimea is the same. And they always say Russia invaded Crimea and annexed. And I always say Russia couldn't invade Crimea. It was already there. Up to 30,000 troops and personnel in Sevastopol. That's been home of the Black Sea Fleet since Catherine the Great. And by the way, Crimea was part of Russia from before 1953. So it's been reunified with Russia. It's full of Russians, probably 90% or so. Roughly, and which is reflects the referendum results there in 2014. So, but again, it's like the West doesn't want to recognize Crimea, but Kosovo, that's perfectly fine. So, they're really weak on this, and nobody wants to delve into the details of this. And they say, well, we want to retake every inch of Ukrainian territory, and we're not going to go to the peace table, and Zelensky's not going to submit to any peace talks until Russia withdraws to its 1991 borders. Well, look, the chances of that happening at this point are the same as Israel withdrawing to its 1949 borders or something like this. As much as anybody would like to see that happen, it's not realistic. Because Israel is a nuclear armed power, vastly outguns and dominates Palestine, the occupied territories, but yet we support Israel's seizure of the Golan Heights, the Sheba Farms, and the Jordan Valley. So it's like the Oslo Accords. It's an interesting parallel. The Oslo Accords, roughly the same period, 8 years of sandbagging to allow Israel to build settlements, and look at the Minsk Accords. It was the same thing, a bogus peace process that was hijacked and undermined by Western interests. So, I mean, hey, look, I'm not trying to tell people how to adjudicate these historical situations. I'm just saying that let's take a wider view of history. Yeah. And let's have an adult conversation about this. And nobody wants to have that conversation in the U.S. media and political spheres in Britain as well. They're completely narrow-minded on this. They don't want to have to consider any extenuating circumstances because it destroys the narrative which they've worked so hard to construct.
Sandbagging in the sports realm means to pretending to be involved fully while lulling your opponent to sleep to try to obtain another objection. And that's exactly what they did in this situation. And you were mentioning pork chop Poroshenko. That's what we called him because we started our show in 2017. I think by our fourth show, we were talking about what was going on in the Ukraine. Pork chop Poroshenko, Biden attended his inauguration. I mean, this guy admitted to building a NATO base inside Ukraine when they weren't even a NATO state. And I just want to ask you a question too as well, because you kind of answered the question that Fam answered. And you can go back to 2004, you can go back to 1991, but just even going back to 2014, from the time they were sandbagging the Minsk agreements 1 and 2, trying to find a peace process, what do you think was the deciding factor? Because I made this tweet the other day, and I would like your opinion because we're probably on the same page as on COVID and what happened with that whole situation. We're there. So we understand what it was all about. I was reading the papers you put out by the 2 doctors with the 4 pillars talking about the global agenda and whatnot. And I kind of try to beat my anti-imperialist friends over the head with what's going on, whatever you want to call it. there's a global agenda. But look at this tweet I put out there. What are your thoughts? The question is, in your opinion, which event, which was most influential in Russia or Putin committing to military action? I want you to give me two answers. I want you to give me the one that was the most influential, but then I want you to give me the one, Patrick, which was the straw that broke the camel's back. NATO won the poll. There was 412 votes. They got about 55%. NATO's expansion eastward. Nazis bombing in the Donbass was second place. Here was my vote. 46 biolabs funded by the DOD. And the last one, Zelensky wanting nukes. In your opinion, which one of these was the major factor in Putin and the Russian Federation going, okay, enough is enough, we're going in there? And which other one was the straw that broke the camel's back? Go right ahead.
Looking at that poll right there, I go with the Vox Populi. I go with the people on that. To me, that sliding scale is pretty accurate. So the NATO expansion issue, that's a long running problem, and Russia went to, it's like it was the November, December of 2021. They went directly to the U.S. Delegation, the State Department. Anthony Blinken had in his hand a letter saying we need to renegotiate the security arrangement for Russia, Europe with you. It needs to happen now. Otherwise, this is going to go badly very quickly. And they pretty much just ignored it. Took their time responding to it as if it was like playing very blasé about it. I really think that the U.S. did everything in its power and NATO. But when we talk about NATO, it's the United States and Britain. Everybody else is a minion state. Let's be realistic.
France got a little.
France has never fully been in NATO. They weren't in NATO before. They were out and then they got pulled back in. So France has always got this independent streak, and that's that's always been a threat to the United States. If you remember Donald Rumsfeld, before the Iraq invasion in 2003, he made this quip about old Europe and new Europe. Francois Mitterrand, the French president, didn't support the Iraq war. Schroeder in Germany at the time, chancellor, he didn't either. And that was old Europe. That was like, we need to deal with old Europe and we need to build a new Europe. And
Libya. But since Libya, they've been all aboard with everything. Sorry, go ahead, Patrick.
Well, the Maghreb and Libya is always France. Sarkozy at the time, felt that that's in their kind of foreign policy sphere. So they kind of front ran the Libya thing. Although who did the heavy lifting on air sorties at the beginning of that conflict was Norway. Norway is the eminence gris of NATO. That's probably the third partner behind Britain for the United States, doing the dirty work on so many different. Cy Hirsch outlined this beautifully in one of his recent articles. But so the whole idea of the NATO expansion, this has been a long-running problem. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is a good allegory here because during 1962, the direct threat, and most people would side with John F. Kennedy, although Russia was really responding to nuclear weapons that U.S. NATO placed in Turkey, very close to Russia's borders at the time. But even leaving that aside, you could back JFK and the United States in the Cuban Missile Crisis and say, yep, that's fine, because the U.S. has already illustrated a Monroe Doctrine for many years, so that's a known entity. Now, the situation that Moscow faces now, they're in the exact same position as JFK and the United States were in 1962. Much worse, in fact, because you have vectors all the way from Kaliningrad in the Baltic Sea, right down along the Eastern European rim, right down below the Black Sea. I mean, potential missile vectors, a nuclear shield being installed in Germany as we speak, plus Czech Republic, and nuclear tipped potential hypersonic missile, 7 minutes air flight if Ukraine becomes a NATO member. And let's also not kid ourselves. Ukraine is a NATO state now. NATO arms, NATO trainers, NATO satellites parked above Ukraine, giving targeting information to NATO armed and trained and NATO officers, U.S. Navy SEALs SAS, SBS, all the top special forces, they're active in Ukraine, and don't let anybody tell you any differently, plus all the mercenaries and soldiers on leave, plus all the gear. Okay, it's a NATO state in everything but name. Okay, so imagine if it was formalized. Imagine if there were missiles, a missile shield in Ukraine. Unacceptable. It'd be unacceptable for us. It'd be unacceptable for Britain if it was all across the English Channel. It would be unacceptable for anybody. And to add to that, and going down your poll list there, so NATO enlargement, the Budapest memorandum or Bucharest memorandum, whatever, where they said Ukraine has to give up their nukes, and Russia guaranteed their safety, and Russia somehow, gone back on that. That 1994 agreement. First of all, they weren't Ukraine's nukes; they were the Soviet Union's nukes. Secondly, it's null and void because that was before NATO expanded right up to the Baltics and right around to the Black Sea. So that's null and void. It's a non-issue on that argument. So, but going down your polling list there, yeah, so the Donbass. So then you have a humanitarian imperative. And so that is defending what Moscow sees as Russian people. So that's a very strong case. So that plays very strong to the Russian domestic audience, and in terms of the national identity. So that's huge. That's massive. And as I said before, Donetsk and Lugansk had done everything to the letter. That's why Russia didn't move in earlier to defend those territories or help those self-defense forces earlier, because they weren't finished with their statehood process, the pre-statehood process. History is going to look back on all of these things. At least Russia's a big believer in international law. I know that will upset a lot of Americans if I say that, but they do have put a lot of faith into the international community and the system. They've always tried to work through the multilateral institutions. This is a special situation that we've had. It was inflamed by the U.S.-backed coup in the Maidan in Kiev in 2014. And that also had changed the whole scope of the whole situation. This could have been avoided very easily, but again, United States and I think they did everything possible to draw Russia into this situation, everything possible, knowing that it could happen and knowing that they would then wage a low-cost war against Russia, but by global sanctions and a global embargo to bring its economy to its knees, and then to somehow create internal pressure that would foment regime change. That's a formula that they've tried with Syria, with Iran, with other countries, Yemen to a lesser degree, and other countries as well. So that's a known formula by the U.S. and NATO. That's just not like we're not spitballing here. Like that's the people in the West, especially the Fox News crowd, still look back and say to themselves, and I'm not picking on the Fox News crowd, the CNN crowd is just the same, that we won the Cold War because of American capitalism, and we brought the Russian Soviet Empire to their knees through the wonders of capitalism. Okay, it's a nice narrative, it's a nice story, but that's not the case. It was the Soviet Union was imploding from within for a number of its own structural inequities and problems, and it was just a question of time before it collapsed for so many different reasons. But we still believe that we can win wars without deploying troops, without deploying military, or to use proxies. The biggest proxy war the United States ever, and its allies ever undertook, much bigger than Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan, was the Syrian war. So 10 years of weapons trafficking, of hundreds of thousands of foreign fighters. So think about the Spanish Civil War, the international brigades, all the multinational effort that went into that. It's the same thing in Syria. We trafficked untold weapons in there from 10 different directions, and even flew in fighters from Uyghurs from Xinjiang province in Western China. So I mean, it was a free for all. And guess what? We haven't won. And by the way, you want to make the territorial integrity claim. Why are we occupying Syria's oil fields in Deir ez-Zor now with 500 U.S. troops, encouraging the Kurds, unilateral secession of Rojava, northeastern Syria, where all their resources are. At the same time, we're sanctioning Syria to choke off their ability to buy oil and buy fuel. I mean, we can't even get into hypocrisy. It's just outrageously, it's way off the charts. But so to anybody pontificating or making these like moral stance about Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine, it's so ridiculous. But when can we have this debate? When can we have this conversation on a mainstream platform or not? That's the thing.
Yeah, you mentioned the sanctions and the sanctions that the West has placed on Russia, and of course Europe also facing a default because of those sanctions. I mean, Germany in particular is falling apart economically because they've lost the cheap energy from Russia. However, the sanctions have not affected Russia in the way the West wanted. Russia has found and opened up its economic relationship with new markets in China, India, Pakistan. It is continuing to develop its relationships with the East and global South now more than ever. And that's clearly a shift that we're seeing, not just with Russia, but it's almost like Russia lit this sort of flame, and then everybody else was like, oh yes, by the way, we're going to try to de-dollarize. We're going to try to find other alternative routes. Right now, a year after the conflict, where do you see this conflict both on the ground? How do you see that ending? And also in terms of the global economy, how do you see this playing out? Because on the horizon, what I'm seeing is China. And of course, I think the other aspect is the China aspect, where the U.S. is, you had Lindsey Graham not too long ago say that they're going to fight to the last
Ukrainian.
Taiwanese person.
Oh, you said the same thing?
And yeah. So they're looking to sort of because China is the bigger economy. China is the more threatening, I think, economy to the United States in terms of unilateralism versus multilateralism. So where do you see all of this going?
Okay. So definitely this attempt to bifurcate the global economy, to drop an iron curtain, a new iron curtain, economic iron curtain along European territory, and to split Russia away from Western Europe and the quote international community. I think it is a bit of a ham-fisted effort, and whatever revenue Russia has lost in terms of oil and gas from supplying Europe, obviously that would be the ideal partner. It's probably going to recoup a large percentage of that through other deals in Asia, and it might end up coming back to supply energy to Europe at some point, maybe in the near future, as soon as peace negotiations begin. It depends how this thing's going to flesh out in Europe. But the whole point of this is long-term geostrategy of the United States. If you read Zbigniew Brzezinski's Grand Chessboard and you're familiar with that being the dominant mode of U.S. grand strategy for the last, let's say, 50, 60 years. And then you add to that British grand strategy, and that's the one that people don't like to talk about, aren't interested in. Hey, the British Empire is no longer a thing. They changed hands after the Second World War, and the United States carried the mantle of the global hegemon, etc., leading the New World Order post World War II, liberal, internationalist, U.S.-led world order. Not the case. The great game, Britain has been playing the great game with Asia and Russia and Eurasia for 300 years. Okay. And the whole point of the great game, which was to make sure that Russia could not join with Europe, specifically Prussia and Germany, as the main emerging mercantile powers and later industrial power of Europe. And that had to be anything to divide that. And not only that, Russia was developing good relations with India.
Very good relations.
So through the 19th century. And so the wars in Afghanistan in the 1900s were to disrupt that. They didn't want to have a Silk Road to Europe, a land road. Britain was a sea power, emergent sea power, dominating East India Trading Company, Dutch East India Company, and so forth. The China Silk Road by sea is really the heart of the British imperial project. So that's what the Great Game was about, and Britain's played it brilliantly, but very messy as well for the people who got caught in the middle of this, like Afghanistan and so many different countries. But so that project is still ongoing. The Belt and Road Initiative is just the latest iteration of that same Silk Road project. That who would benefit the most from an overland trade railway and highway network connecting Europe to Asia? Of course, Germany is well positioned to benefit the most by their expertise, their innovation, and their industrial acumen. But where were they getting their energy from? Well, they're getting it from Russia. Cheap, affordable, long-term contract gas that would power the German. And so Germany would then become powerful. And that was always the goal of the U.S., was to keep that the Secretary General, British Secretary General of NATO, Hastings Ismay, in 1952, said the whole purpose of NATO, remember, is to keep the Americans in Europe, the Russians out, Soviets at the time, and the Germans down. Because the West, Britain and U.S. believe that if Germany becomes too powerful, then they can then direct European political and economic affairs. So NATO is nothing more than the glove in which the U.S. can insert its hand to steer economic and political affairs of Europe. It's that simple. It's always been that way. And Britain is the chief whip for the United States in that process. So the new function of NATO is as a protection racket. It's an international protection racket. You buy our weapons, we'll protect you. You buy our fuel. It's more expensive, but like the wise guy and the mafia wise guy, hey, it's a little bit more expensive, but you know what? We'll give you some extra protection. It's worth it. Take our LNG.
Nobody robs old Tony.
Forget about it. You want to buy.
Nobody. Banks get knocked off. Nobody knocks off old Tony. Please continue, Patrick.
That's right. There's a lot of broken windows around Europe. It's kind of getting dangerous here. But that's what NATO is. It's a protection racket. Yeah. It's functioning. It's like the perfect protection racket. They're getting all these European countries to empty their stockades, which become scrap metal in Ukraine. And they backfill them. They say, we'll backfill Poland, get rid of your MiGs, give them to Zelensky. We'll backfill those with new Typhoons and F-16s. They're not giving them new planes for free. They're going to buy those. Polish taxpayers are going to pay for that. Poland's going to go into debt to buy British and American defense gear, latest gear, okay? Plus the permanent U.S. base in Poland, permanent U.S. base. So the Iron Curtain gets pushed further east. And that's where the U.S. is right now, by the way. Germany's under the bus. They'll still occupy Germany, Stuttgart, Ramstein, and the NSA listing base, etc. They're all the drone, global logistics, the satellite link-ups are all out of Germany. The Iron Dome in Tel Aviv and the Iron Dome in Israel is managed out of Stuttgart, Germany. That's a U.S. Patriot missile battery array. That's what the Iron Dome is, managed out of Germany. But Poland will be so that'll be the prize for Washington. If they can't get a military victory in Ukraine, the prize is we've moved our footprint further east and expanded NATO to the north, and hopefully maybe pick up Moldova to the south. Georgia is probably a non-starter. Mm-hmm. So Washington has to sell this, all the money they've spent and all the political capital that's been expended, and what Ukraine has had to, lose in terms of people and territory. They have to get a win out of this. What's the win? It's the win is pushing the Iron Curtain to the east and expanding NATO. They could walk away from that and sort of say, we saved Europe from Putin's not marching on Paris right now, like Hitler. I mean, that's the narrative I think that the West, Biden or whoever comes after him, would want to sell.
Well, Let me just say this much, and like I say this to my business partner Fiorella over here, Patrick. We need to work on your Italian New York accent. I'm gonna work on that with you guys. We'll get you in a better spot. You guys are okay. You have heart, but you're just missing it a little bit. But since I have you on here, and I threw up the biolabs as one of the choices. There's 47 biolabs funded by the State Department or the Pentagon. Excuse me. We have receipts on this. We know this. A lot of people said that. That's when Putin was good. When he went in there in the beginning, he went all throughout Ukraine, bombing those labs and getting rid of them. So the question I have is, where do you place Putin and Xi on the Great Reset? I mean, do you look at them as a player in the Great Reset, or do you look at them as with some of us think that they're both walking away, going, nah, have fun, Klaus. You guys do your thing. We're out of this. You've made bioweapons maybe to target our DNA. I mean, that's why I think a lot of people were kind of freaked out. I mean, it did take place in Wuhan. We don't know if and I agree with you. And it is not a lab leak. Stop using the term leak anymore, but we're on YouTube, so let's not say anything else. But what is your thoughts? Where is Putin and Xi on the Great Reset? A player, or are they just walking away?
I'll comment on that, and I'll also comment on the biolabs, because that's a subject I know very well, having worked on investigations on the Lugar Center in Georgia as well years back. Okay, so I'm really familiar with this issue. But in terms of the Great Reset, I think the best way to look at that is, well, obviously Russia's been erased from the World Economic Forum's website in all shapes and pages and images, gone. That should tell you all you need to know about there's this kind of proclivity in alternative media for this Manichean worldview that sees Klaus Schwab lording over the world. And it might have looked like that in the aftermath of the so-called pandemic, but the reality is, in terms of hard power and geopolitics, Russia is a major global player in energy as well. You can't have a fourth industrial revolution unless you can power the baseload of a modern European city. And I've got a news flash for the Greens. Wind and solar ain't going to cut it. So eventually they have to go, and neither is paying fivefold for U.S. LNG by bottle on a boat from Texas. It's not going to work. So you're going to have to end up going back to, quote, fossil fuels, hydrocarbons, more accurately, hydrocarbons. You're going to have to go back to that. So then the question is, you should always ask yourself, is the Great Reset driving geopolitics, or is geopolitics driving the Great Reset? And the United States has never fully been in the Paris Accords. And if you look at the bottom line, yeah, they're pushing the Green New Deal, and they're pushing all these sort of Great Reset policies. But in my opinion, a lot of this has been just to convince the rest of Europe to go along with it, because the United States has to be seen to be doing it. But the U.S. can pull back from that at a moment's notice and throw Europe completely under the bus and get Europe dependent on their fossil fuels. And guess what? Look what happened in the last 6 months, 12 months. That's exactly what's happening.
Fuels, yeah.
So I've written extensively on this for a New Dawn magazine at 21st Century Wire, and I've said that's the research question. And I think that geopolitics drives the Great Reset. In other words, the Great Reset is a tool of geopolitics, because who is at the top of the heap in terms of great powers? That has not changed. So it's still the United States and its allies, and then you have China and the BRICS nations as well, forming their own interest bloc, but it's not formalized yet. So China will go along with the green climate change conversation to a degree, but at the end of the day, they're building a coal plant every month in China. So it's not anything that's constraining them at the moment. Same with Russia. So listen, Russia and China, and before this conflict began, if you're running these countries and you have representation at the UN and sustainable development goal meetings and stuff, you have to send your people there. You have to have representatives there. You've got to send your people to the World Economic Forum. You've got to be on board with AI. You even have to have a contingency for central bank digital currency, even if it's not your preferred mode of financial vehicle for currency. You still have to have your finger in it, because if half the world goes for it and you don't, you could end up potentially being cut off from a new system. So in that sense, everyone's kind of globalized. It's a globalized world, and they're all kind of tied into each other in that sense. It doesn't mean that they're, in league with Schwab and plotting to somehow take down the good, liberty-loving, freedom people of the world. It's not that simple. That's one of the fatal flaws that you get in alternative and independent discourse. They get sucked into it a little bit too far, and then they lose sight of realist international politics. Yeah.
They blaming China for everything, from the American right, the populist right, the America First right. Like, I said that in my speech there at that Rage Against the War Machine. Don't think we're going to let you take money out of Kiev to end the proxy war with Moscow, and then go over to China into Taiwan and start a proxy war with Beijing. So yeah, I think a lot of people do in this sphere of independent media get caught up on certain things. Fam, I'm so sorry. Your question.
Just my last question is, do you see this conflict ending soon in terms of Russia and Ukraine? I mean, there's not much else that Ukraine can do, to be honest. The West continues supplying them, and Lavrov and Putin have both said the more the West continues supplying Ukraine with long-range missiles, the further Russia will have to push in to make sure that its borders are protected. Russia has stated this many times. They've also stated that they're ready for diplomacy and for peace talks, but that doesn't mean that Russia's just going to leave, as is what NATO wants. And another thing that's been going on is Russia has almost encircled the area of Artyomovsk, or what is known now as Bakhmut. And that area is a very crucial strategic point for the military. It allows the passage of weapons and of soldiers. And without that, it's going to take a really, really a detriment to Ukraine's army. And that's just one of the major strongholds. But we're seeing Russia now push further and further in. And of course, what you mentioned earlier, the reality that the West is getting in media is that Russia's losing, when that's really clearly not the case here. Do you see this conflict ending soon? In what ways? I mean, it's just, nobody knows, but in your opinion?
Yeah, nobody knows. Nobody knows. Look, this started from a U.S. perspective. That's the dominant actor on that side of things. So what Washington wants and does is going to determine the trajectory of this period. And forget about the international community. Didn't make a difference in Iraq, ain't gonna make a difference here.
Yeah.
So it's a political problem in America, because half of America believes, or more than half believe, that Russia somehow meddled in the 2016 elections and put Donald Trump in power, and that sort of builds the anti-Russian hate that's become so in vogue in America. That's a political problem. And so to have a country supporting this level of military support and cash to throw into a black hole indefinitely, that's a political issue. So if it's a political problem, then the solution, of course, is not going to be military. It can't be. It has to be a political solution. The political solution would come in the form of new leadership in an election, through the process of a national election campaign, where the issue then changes and takes shape. Now, Russia has time on its side, because this is in their backyard. Ukraine does not have time on its side. Zelensky is probably fighting off a palace coup as we speak, and that will be a constant threat. And if there's any peace talks or any ceasefire, he's out, period, because people are going to blame him straight away for destroying the country and not following through with the Minsk peace processes like he promised he would when he ran for president. Okay, he's not being held accountable. Again, first point we made, because it's a, quote, state of war or state of emergency. So for the U.S., they don't have time on their side. 2024 election cycle, any Republican, Donald Trump's already occupying the anti-war this last week. He said that we need to end this. This is a waste. Zelensky's, it's a disaster. So he's already gazumped all of the Republican field on this. So that's Trump's area. The Democrats are now having to play catch up on that. So they can't parrot Trump's position. So they have to do something different. And that might be a longer path. So Russia has time on its side. The U.S. doesn't. NATO doesn't. Europe definitely doesn't. Europe is at the end of its rope right now, today. Germany, France, other countries, there's anti-NATO protests popping up. They will not be able to contain them unless COVID reappears and they lock everybody down again. So they don't have time on their side either. So from that point of view, we could see movement in some kind of negotiations in the next few months, few weeks, few months, maybe 6 months. Or this could continue on for a year or two of us just continue plowing weapons and giving military support, maybe playing some sabotage games along the periphery. But that's no good, because if Ukraine doesn't have soldiers to fight, it doesn't matter how many tanks you give them. And it doesn't matter how many jets you park on an airfield in Lviv. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So it's an unwinnable, from a military point of view, this is unwinnable. Politically, it's only winnable so long as it's happening. As soon as the pause comes, then the politics changes completely. And then the other people rush in to take advantage of the potential victory of being part of the negotiation for peace. And there's some political capital to be won there. That's where Donald Trump is putting his, or as Ron DeSantis is also opined the same way on that this past week. So, but yeah, so that's my kind of thoughts on this. I mean, it's got a time limit on it, but you know, the bleeding could be severe before that happens. So, I hope that the politics in America can transform the situation a little bit and steer it in the right direction. And NATO doesn't do anything stupid like make a major false flag or a provocation like a dirty bomb or something like that, which almost happened at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant when Ukrainian forces were shelling the nuclear power plant. That didn't even make it into the Western press. But if there was any kind of a radiological incident, that would have been all over our media, and guess who would have been blamed for letting off a tactical nuke or a dirty bomb? Would have been Russia.
Absolutely.
Do you need evidence for that? Of course you don't, because the hyperdrive of the media would be in full swing, and we'd be boom on war footing like in 24 hours. And just like every other false flag or misunderstanding throughout history, nobody would have time to sort out the details until after the smoke clears. And we do not want to be in that position. I'll tell you, not with Russia and the United States and other nuclear powers involved. We do not want to be in that position, period. That would just be the worst possible outcome.
I've never heard the word gazumped before, but how do you spell that? Gazumped?
It's a real estate term.
It is?
It's in Britain, it's a real estate term. It's when you see a property and someone runs and buys it, or to flip it before a real buyer could come in to buy it properly. You got gazumped. I had my eyes on that one, but we got gazumped.
We got gazumped. Well, you know, a lot has changed with this whole conflict. You know, do you think Putin will try to take Kiev? I don't think there's any way that he'll let any type of puppet government exist in Ukraine ever again. In the beginning of the conflict, I thought, no, he'll just annex, or, you know, and once again, I don't even think we should say annex. These people voted over 92% between both regions, whether it be Crimea or the Donetsk or the Luhansk regions. They voted overwhelmingly to rejoin the Russian Federation. And I said at that time, Putin will find a way to just make a deal, find a way to peacefully calm things down and move on. He'll take that and go. But I don't think Putin will allow, or the Russian Federation for that matter, will allow a government to exist the way it did in Kiev. What are your thoughts? With everything going on in Bakhmut and that region about to be sewn up for Russia, do you think he'll then now use the reserves? Because let's also point out, while this Western media was sitting saying that they're going to have a winter offensive, they never said that. I can't find one Russian official that said winter is coming and here we come. The reserves they got lining up, they'll be ready by the end of March. And after they take Bakhmut, here they can go now and take the whole country. Do you see that happening in your personal opinion, Patrick?
Listen, a lot of things could happen. Things could change very quickly. You saw how quickly Russia rolled into Ukraine in the first couple of weeks of the conflict, of the special military operation, Russian intervention last February, March. It was very quick. And, you know, from a military strategic point of view, U.S. military heads, there's experts on every corner now in the U.S., but they'll say that And the popular CNN, Beltway, Fox talking point is Russia, Putin tried to take Kiev, but he was met with fierce resistance from the Ukrainians, and he got more than he bargained for, and he had to turn tail and run. And it was a humiliating defeat for Vladimir Putin. What they failed to mention, of course, is while that was happening, Russia secured Mariupol and secured all the important industrial sectors, right down to basically create a land bridge to Crimea, which strategically is what they wanted to do from the beginning.
And the troops had to stay in Kiev then and guard it. They couldn't go out. I mean, that was genius in my mind. They had to stay there.
Yeah, it held up. It held up a large portion of the Ukrainian forces, and also it created a whole distraction for the Western media because Kiev, that's the big ticket, right? So this is called a fate in military strategy terms. Is that what happened? It certainly looks like it. And let the military historians and write the memoirs of the Russian generals. They'll figure that out later. But what would happen if Russia was to take Kiev? They wouldn't have to take it at that point. It would be a negotiated entrance to secure and demilitarize, or they would provide the security as the victors. And so this might also come, and here's where it gets sticky. This might also come with a quid pro quo on the European side. Because if you look at the history of major wars in Europe, the great powers on the Western side will always want to carve up the spoils. And so in this case, Poland would want to repatriate part of Western Ukraine into Poland, ergo into the European Union as well, into NATO. And they might see that as a security concern. That's not them, by the way. That's the United States working through them. But and then a demilitarized zone somewhere along those lines, a DMZ, a North Korean frozen conflict zone, something like that. So there would have to be some kind of a reciprocal agreement with Russia that they would get something if Russia got something. It would have to be that way. That's always been that way in history. So I would be surprised if that didn't happen this time. So that's and as far as Odessa goes, that is a huge unresolved issue there because that area identifies as part of the Russian world, Novorossiya, and just historically more than any other region in Ukraine. So, and that would be the ultimate national security achievement for Russia, because if they were to retake Odessa, they would then probably have join up with Transnistria, would be absorbed into the Russian Federation. But that would also create a security problem. So with those tenuous new Russian Federation additional regions there, they would have to push out further into Ukraine to create, again, a security buffer zone. And so if we're having this conversation, then actually I reconsider my last point on whether this is going to end soon. Maybe not. I mean, maybe Russia has a lot of work to do, and it would take them years to achieve that. Are they willing to pay that price and time and treasure and blood? Probably yes. Probably yes. They'd rather do it now than have to do it again in 10 or 15 or 20 years. So it's not a pretty picture any way you cut it. It's not pretty for Ukraine. It's not pretty for Europe and U.S. got Atlantic and Pacific on each side, friendly neighbors to the north and south. We don't care. It's a business transaction for us. We get rebuilding contracts, missile shields, gear. We'll do fine. The United States will do absolutely fine, no matter what happens. And that's the problem, actually, if you want to drill right down to it.
Yeah. Fam, anything else for Mr. Patrick Henningsen while we got him here? Because I can't wait to get him on and talk some COVID stuff. So
on the biolabs, okay. What we learned when I was working with a really good journalist from Bulgaria, Diliana Gaycheniera, on the Luger Center story, and she did amazing research on this. We learned that the staff at this U.S. biolab had diplomatic passports, diplomatic immunity. Okay, why would you have diplomatic immunity? And and this is something to consider with all of those biolabs in Ukraine. It's not a question of what they were working on. Nobody knows for sure. And would it be of any consequence? Because, this is for another conversation we can have, but the bioweapons industry is one of the biggest vaporware industries ever. Okay, think of the dot-com boom. They have, but it attracts the most amount of funding because it's a hangover from the Cold War. What it is, however, is an amazing front for intelligence operations, because they can go anywhere in the world, and it's about threat reduction, DoD, defense threat reduction, pandemic reduction, protecting the world from pathogens, securing former Soviet biostocks, and etc. It's a great, you can go anywhere, you can get carte blanche, you can set up major facilities right along the Russian border. It is the most beautiful intelligence front you could possibly ever imagine. And the bonus is all the big contractors and big pharma and who build the BSL labs, all American companies, that's just money for nothing, basically. So I look at it in that sense. Of course, Russia has to take it seriously as a potential threat, as China would or anybody would, but it's really tenuous, because if you look at what they've produced, there's been no breakthroughs in gain of function.
Never.
And none of these bioweapons, as we know them in a Hollywood sense, have ever been released or ever really been seen to work in the world. And if you look at the history of bioweapons, a lot of it is BS, but it's really lucrative BS. You can, if you just patent, you register a patent of a spike protein or something, you can raise tens of millions of dollars on the back of that patent application, or when you get a patent secured. It doesn't mean that you've actually produced anything. And that's one of the biggest scams of any industry, is biotech and genomic sequencing. And we're just learning about this now. So I look at the lab leak as the same sort of thing. I think China has been duped by the U.S. government, and look at everybody now suddenly believes the U.S. government because they released a report on lab leak, and all of a sudden, oh, it's true because the U.S. government says it's true. I mean, how easily people are manipulated. That's my take, and I have a lot more to offer on that. But on the Ukrainian biolab side, rightly, Russia's taking it very seriously, but I think it was more of a military intelligence front by the United States and Germany, the Bundeswehr and the U.S. military, the DoD, were running all of those labs from Kharkiv all the way along the border, all of them. So it's a great front. Look, because they were preparing for this for years, this conflict. And I think those CIA facilities there, some of those companies who built those labs had seed funding from InQtel, the CIA seed funder. So, and Hunter Biden is probably has some immunity level with the CIA, and his old man probably set that up.
Yeah.
So that's why he'll only get a slap on the wrist, because he was half protected by the company. Just think of Barry Seal, able to do all the side business, but still working with the agency. More likely, that's a more plausible explanation of what you're looking at there. All this side hustle.
Barry Seal, though, was thrown to the wolves, though, right? I mean, I don't know if that's going to happen with Hunter, but Zelensky, Zelensky might be Gaddafi. Remember Gaddafi? We were against him till we were with him. Then we were against him again. They threw him to the wolves.
If Hunter Biden was Barry Seal, it would have been a very different ending to that story.
Yeah.
So that's the difference. So, but all I'm saying here is consider more possibilities of what you're looking at. I think there's more to these stories, I think, than whatever the mainstream is serving up right now on this stuff. I guarantee you it's completely limited hangout, and it's completely made for misdirection. That's my instinct. I've always betted on that way, and I've been 90% right every time. So if you're betting on horses, that's pretty good. You might lose a couple, but
I'll go into the horse track with you, pal.
Yeah, I know some good horse tipsters. I don't gamble, though. That's not my game, but I know some good ones.
Ladies and gentlemen, Patrick Henningsen here. Let everybody know where they can find you. And I know you're on TNT Radio. What days, what times? Where's your Substack at? Your Twitter, the whole 9 yards. I got so many things I want to talk to you about. This was just the tip of the iceberg. I am glad you came on. Please come on again soon.
Yeah. No, so my main website, of course, is 21stcenturywire.com. I've been going for over 10 years as an independent media platform. And the main show there is the Sunday Wire. It's live every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 5 p.m. UK time. That's a long form 3-hour live radio stroke podcast. And then TNT Radio, Monday to Friday from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's 4 p.m. till 6 p.m. UK time. And that's 5 days a week. That's action-packed live radio. Again, gets converted into podcast. And also I do the UK Column News, which is the top UK alternative media outlet. And I do live on television Fridays. I'm a co-anchor on that program. Great organization. And I do that from 1 p.m. UK time until I think it finishes about 3 p.m. So 2 hours. So we do 7 shows a week plus daily content on 21st Century Wire. I'm not on Substack yet, but I will be hopefully soon. I haven't quite got there yet, so I'm a little bit
You're
slow.
You're a
overloaded.
busy man.
I know. Holy
Yeah.
cow, you're like us. See the RT Convo Couch, AM. We have all these shows and everything going on, but you know, sometimes it's necessary to get that information out there. I think your work has been truly amazing, Patrick, and I look forward to having more conversations with you down the road.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much,
Thank you for inviting me. It's great talking to you. Great to meet you guys.
And I'd love to come on your show and talk about elections because I got the goods for you there. I got some stuff for you. I got some really good stuff. I know that TNT audience, they love election stuff. Anytime I go on a TNT show, they want to know about elections. That's why I like that network, because I feel that you guys are very centered. You know what I'm saying? You're all over the place. You can't put yourself in a box. You're not conservative. You're not liberal. You're independent minded, and continue to do that great work out there, my friend.
Yep. Yeah. We can't put us in a box like Rage Against the War Machine and other things like this. It's not easy to categorize, but we're all kind of trying to find out the truth about what's going on in the world as best we can, get closest to it, and do the best we can.
Thank you so much, Patrick.
Thank you, Patrick.